The right to a pension has long been a central pillar of the European social contract. However, as populations age and fertility rates fall, states are now struggling to make the numbers work and, save for a massive increase in productivity, can no longer afford to have people retiring on a full pension, as was once the norm. But pensions are an extremely politically charged topic, with governments across the continent struggling to implement reforms in face of massive public resistance. So, in this video, we're going to take a closer look at why the European pension system is under significant strain, why it's been so difficult to reform, and why it's bad news for European economies. Let's start by breaking down how pensions actually work in European countries. There are two main types of pension systems in Europe: funded and unfunded systems. The most common model is the unfunded system, also known as a pay-as-you-go system. The contributions collected from today's workers are used directly to pay today's retirees. The system sort of functions as a kind of generational contract. Current workers finance the retirement of the older generation, with the expectation that future workers will do the same for them. Countries such as France, Germany, Italy, Spain, and Portugal rely heavily on this model. Funded systems operate slightly differently. Workers and employers contribute to collective pension funds that invest the money over decades in public and private assets, including stocks, bonds, property, and infrastructure. The accumulated savings and investment returns are then used to pay pensions when contributors retire. Rather than depending primarily on the next generation of workers, funded systems rely on long-term capital accumulation and market returns. Countries like the Netherlands, Sweden, Denmark, and Switzerland have the most developed funded systems. In recent years, pressure on pension systems has intensified as Europe undergoes a profound demographic transition. Specifically, rising life expectancy combined with persistently low birth rates has led to a rapidly aging population. For context, since 2000, fertility rates across Europe have remained well below the replacement level of 2.1 children per woman, typically ranging between 1.2 and 1.9, depending on the country. At the same time, life expectancy at age 65 has risen by roughly 2.5 years since 2000, and today the EU's average life expectancy is around 81 years. As a result, Europe's population is not only getting older on average, but the balance between workers and retirees is shifting dramatically. According to the European Commission's 2024 projections, the old age dependency ratio, which measures the ratio of people aged 65 and over relative to the working age population, rose from around 24% in 2000 to 32.7% in 2020, and is expected to reach approximately 53.8% by 2070. In practical terms, this means the EU could move from roughly 3 working age people supporting each person over 65 today to fewer than 2 by 2045. This has placed significant strain on pension systems, but particularly on countries with unfunded systems, because they are directly dependent on the size of the workforce. Therefore, as the ratio between working age and pensioners declines, governments who rely most on unfunded and state pensions must either choose to raise contributions, meaning that each worker pays more into the system, reduce benefits so that retirees get smaller pensions, or borrow to cover the gap, mainly by using public debt to fund pensions. Now, the former two measures are pretty unpopular with European electorates, and politically sensitive to say the least. In Brussels, police clashed with trade unions last October, who were demonstrating over austerity measures that include raising the age of retirement from 65 to 67 by 2030. Belgium got off lightly when compared to France, which witnessed months of protests in 2023 when President Emmanuel Macron raised the retirement age from 62 to 64. Then, late last year, to prevent a collapse in government, Macron's Prime Minister was forced to suspend the reforms until at least 2028, or until the next presidential election. Therefore, to avoid a political fallout, it normally falls on the state to borrow more to fill the gap. Aging-related public spending, including pensions and other adjacent aging-related expenditures like healthcare costs, is already large, accounting for the equivalent of roughly a quarter of GDP across the euro area. Pensions make up around half of that, around 11.4%, and are expected to increase by 0.4% by 2070. That might not sound like a lot, but first, predicted expenditure varies a lot, and second, even a small rise can add a lot of strain on public finances, particularly for countries that run pretty massive deficits, such as Italy, Portugal, Belgium, Spain, France, and Cyprus. Take France, which has one of the most generous pension schemes in Europe, averaging out at about €1,500 a month or €18,000 a year, and with the lowest qualifying age of the main EU economies. All this comes at considerable expense. State pensions cost France 13.4% of GDP, one of the highest levels in Europe, and well above the OECD average of 8.1%. By 2035, the pension deficit is expected to reach €15 billion. This has helped push France's public debt over 113% of GDP, which really hasn't been great news for France's economy. This has led to a steep increase in French borrowing costs, at least in part because the bond markets are worried that the required fiscal consolidation in implementing pension reforms is politically impossible. France is likely to continue running large deficits for the foreseeable future, which has also led to an increased risk of default, which has spooked investors. And as such, markets are demanding higher interest rates to compensate for this risk. Higher bond yields don't just make it more expensive to issue new debt, they also make it more expensive to service France's enormous pre-existing debt pile, and France could soon be trapped in a sort of doom loop, where high servicing costs force more debt, which means higher servicing costs, etc. Brussels has also raised concerns about rising debt levels in several member states, some of which have breached the EU's fiscal rules. These rules require governments to keep annual budget deficits below 3% of GDP and public debt below 60% of GDP, thresholds that a number of countries are currently exceeding. Since Brussels can't directly push member states to reform their pension system, Brussels is instead considering pressuring member states by linking its annual country-specific recommendations with pension reforms to access funds from the next long-term EU budget. Brussels is also trying to encourage member states heavily dependent on unfunded pensions to shift towards funded pensions by encouraging private retirement savings and occupational pension schemes. In Brussels' view, this would not only help reduce pressure on public finances, as ageing drives up costs, but to channel long-term savings into European capital markets. As is so often the case these days, a lot of how this plays out depends on influence. Not only who technically has the power to make things happen, but also who has the sway to make sure it does. That's why last year we put together a list of the world's 25 most influential people, using rankings from you, our audience, as well as from our journalists. This year we've done the same, producing a brand new ranking for 2026. In the upcoming issue of our magazine Too Long, we explore our list, telling the stories of a number of people who made the list, from the return of Donald Trump and the calculated moves of Xi Jinping to the AI frontiers of Sam Altman. We look to the new entries, New York's first Muslim mayor Zohran Mamdani, the radical shift of Pope Leo XIV, and bastions of technocracy like Prime Minister Mark Carney, as well as the shadows that still linger, like Jeffrey Epstein. As always, this issue of Too Long features a whole lot more than just our most influential people ranking though. We also have a whole featured segment on how the UK became more divided than ever, and how a broken country could rebuild, the fragmentation emerging within the EU, how religion is being used by politicians around the world, and much, much more. You can pre-order your copy at toolong.news, or to get the best deal, you can just subscribe to the magazine. Doing so gets you 20% off every copy for the lifetime of your subscription, and if you use code SPRING26, you'll get an additional £3 off your first copy, bringing the price as low as £4.99. Find out more and order your copy today at toolong.news.